Hey there, this video is going to be a full menu walkthrough for shooting video on the Sony A6700. Not going to be covering any photography stuff in this video, but if you're looking to get the best possible image quality while shooting video on the A6700, that's what I'm going to go over in this video. So, disclaimer up front here, there are so many ways to do all this stuff, but I've shot on almost every Sony camera, and I've kind of dialed in how I like to set up these cameras to get the best possible image quality. That's what I'm going to go over in this video. All right, so get your A6700 out so you can follow along. If not, you can skip around later. There are chapter markers down below. Okay, before I turn the camera on, I just want to make sure that we're in manual exposure mode because that's how you're going to get the best possible image quality. And also the back dial here, make sure that you are set to movie mode, not photo or S&Q, but we will talk about S&Q in this video. So I'm going to turn the camera on here, and I do want to mention that I have reinitialized the camera and basically wiped it all out. So this is how you get it when it's fresh from Sony. So I'm going to go here and select English. And I'm going to try to breeze through some of these initial things. Do not connect. Okay. Set the date and time. I am not going to actually set this right now. Okay, this here is super important, and I am really glad that Sony has started putting this in the startup menu, because you make sure you set the auto power off temp to high. If you don't, your camera will definitely overheat, and this is true on like every Sony camera. It used to be something that I used to have to remind everyone to go and do, but now they prompt you right away. So no excuses. It prompts you to do this. Make sure you set this to high. Super important. Basically what this does is it allows the camera to run warmer, and they put this in there sort of as a cover their butt kind of situation so that the camera will actually get warmer, but you don't want the camera overheating, so please set this to high. So hit set and hit OK. So this is telling us a little bit about the new touch menu system that's on here, which is on some of the other cameras, the newer cameras. I don't really like this so much, but I will explain what this does. Essentially, there's some menus that show up on the left and the right of the screen. You can swipe left and right to toggle them on and off. And then if you swipe up and down from the bottom, that will bring up the function menu button. So we will talk about that. Let's get right into that to start. So first of all, you can see there's a bunch of menu items here on the right and left. So on the right here, we have record. This is the skin softening effect. I do not recommend using that. I really don't like the way what it does. The next one down here is the subject detection. So we can toggle this between all the different subject detections. A lot of these things that are here you can find elsewhere. So I generally don't use this, but I'll show you what all of these things do. This is the touch tracking features. So this would be touch focus. This is touch tracking. What touch tracking is when you touch an object, it will then track it. So you could like touch on something that would move, you touch it, and then it'll hold on that subject and move around and stay focused. You can also do touch tracking and auto exposure, but usually touch tracking is where I leave it. There's auto exposure with the touch. Again, we're going to be shooting in manual exposure mode, so I'm not going to use that, and this is to turn it off. So let's just leave this on touch tracking. The button down here is the play button to play back anything that's in the camera in terms of videos. We can also just press the actual play button, so I don't use that. Over here on the left-hand side, we have the timer, so you can turn that on to have it start 3 seconds later. This is how you can turn autofocus to manual focus. Again, we'll see this in a different spot. This is for picture profiles, which I'm going to recommend that you shoot in S-Log3. We're not going to use that. And this is for the creative look. Again, we're not going to use that because we're going to be shooting in S-Log. So again, I don't use this because this stuff shows up in a lot of other places. In my opinion, are actually easier and quicker to access. So to access this on and off, you just swipe to get it off, swipe to get it on. If you like this, feel free to use it. I'm just going to talk about my personal preferences. Now, one other cool thing that Sony's added recently is the ability to change a lot of the exposure controls by touching, and I love this. This is something that Canon cameras have had for a long time. So if you just touch the shutter speed, you can then change it. So that's super nice to be able to do that. But what I recommend usually is setting buttons and dials to things you use often, because these are kind of small and hard to touch. And also, when you're using the camera, it's just quicker to pull up a dial and change things. But you can just do that really easily here, so that is really nice. Okay, so there aren't a lot of buttons to customize, and I'll talk about how to set the dials and stuff in a little bit later, but the main thing I want to talk about is the menu system, and the biggest part about that is the main menu. So that is this first two screens, and I find that almost everything is in these two screens, and we can also use the function button and function menu, which I will talk about a little bit later. So before we get into the main menu, I just want to show you the structure here. So we have all the different folders of different things over here, and then we also have the subfolders and then the items. over on the right-hand side, and then over here, you can see we have the page number. So there's a lot of different ways that we can access and refer to all this kind of stuff. But let's go back to the main menu because frankly, pretty much everything that I need is in the main menu. And this is one of the coolest things about Sony's latest iteration of menus is this main menu because everything's in there. Now I'm gonna kind of jump around a little bit because if you set something, you have to reset something else. And so I'm just going to skip around a little bit, but I will explain everything. So the first thing I want to do is go down to page 2 and go to log shooting settings. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to select on. The only other option here is off or on, and on is flexible ISO. If you're curious what flexible ISO or ISO is, this is basically the normal method of doing exposure in cameras. The other option, which is not in this camera that you find in cameras like the FX30, FX3, FX6, is Cine EI. So nothing to worry about here. Either turn log shooting on or off. This is different from if you've used other cameras like the other 6000 series cameras where you have to go in and select picture profile 8 or picture profile 9. They've actually taken those out because this is how they recommend that you turn log shooting on and off if you're coming new to the A6700 from one of those earlier cameras. So color gamut, we want to shoot in S-Gamut 3.Cine and S-Log3. This is what I recommend because this camera shoots in 10-bit. So again, if you're coming from one of the 8-bit cameras, the earlier 6000 series cameras, I'd recommend shooting S-Log2, but S-Log3 here. Embed LUT file. So what this does, it doesn't actually bake the LUT into the footage. What this does is it records the LUT that you used in the metadata. So if you pull this up in Catalyst Browse, it will show which LUT you were using when you were monitoring and recording. But again, it doesn't bake the LUT into the file. You're still going to get a log file or log image out of it. But if you're passing this footage on to someone else and they wanted to know, hey, like what LUT were you using while you were exposing and recording this, they'll have a record of that. So just leave it on. It doesn't do anything really for most of us. Let's go back up to the first page here and do some of our basic settings. The first one I'm going to change is the file format. So there are 5 different options, and if you are shooting in HD, there's 2 different options. You have XAVC-S and XAVC-SI, but I'm going to talk about the 4K options. So the one I recommend for most people is going to be the XAVC-HS 4K, and this one here is an H.265 codec, but it gives you really good image quality and pretty small file sizes. So if your computer can handle H.265, I recommend this. This is what I generally shoot in because it's smaller files and still gives me really good image quality. The other option here is XAVC, there's 2 other options. Another one is XAVC-S 4K. So this is the same bitrate as the HS, but this is an H.264 codec. So this one will be easier to handle on your computer. This is an IPB codec or long op codec, and what that does is the camera records not every frame, but it records some of the frames, and then your computer has to interpolate the information between the frames. And so this can give you some artifacting with fast-moving subjects, but it also is more taxing on your computer because it has to basically figure out the compression and work a little bit harder. So, but the file sizes are about the same as the HS, but the HS is going to be higher quality. And then lastly, if you want the least compressed codec and highest quality that the camera can offer, that's going to be the XAVC-SI. This is an all-intra codec, so the camera actually records every single frame. This gives you the least amount of artifacts, the highest image quality, the highest bit rate, so biggest file size, and also easiest on your computer to edit. But what I said, I do like the HS, and that's what I use most of the time. Okay, so next to that we have the record settings. So this is basically the codecs and bit rates, and we're gonna change this to the highest one. Actually, I forgot I had to change the frame rate first, so let's do that. So going up to the top here, because once you change the frame rate, it will change the bit rates as well. So when you go in here, you have 24, 60, and 120. So I shoot everything in 24 frames per second. Now, if you're curious why there is no 30 frames per second, that's because for some weird quirk, it doesn't exist in the HS. So if you want to shoot 30p, then switch to S, for example, or SI, and then you can get 30p. So, but as I said, I like the HS codec, and so we're gonna be at 24p. In terms of this shutter speed, for me, I don't change this. I shoot at double the frame rate, so if I'm at 24 frames per second, I'm gonna set this to 1/50 and leave it there. The aperture, we can change that, of course, while we're shooting. We're gonna need to change that depending on the depth of field and light that we need. In terms of the ISO, so I don't recommend auto ISO. I recommend shooting at the base ISO, which is 800 in S-Log3. Now you can see if you go below 800, these numbers here have bars underneath them, and that's because that is indicating that it's below the base ISO. The base ISO of 800 will give you the best possible dynamic range of that this camera can offer in terms of balancing the highlights and the shadows. I recommend that you shoot at the base ISO of 800. So if you need to shoot in lower light situations, of course, open up the aperture on your lens as much as possible, and then take off your ND filter. And then at that point, you can start raising the ISO if you really need to. But for most situations, leave it at the ISO of 800. You'll get the best image. So auto white balance, I turn that off. I set it to one of the default settings here. Generally leave it on sunny or daylight, or use the custom white balance, which is very easy to do. And so to do that, you go down to here. You hit set, you put a gray card in front of it, and it's really easy to do. But generally, don't leave it on auto white balance, because what will happen is the camera will shift throughout the course of the scene or the shot, and then you're gonna have a nightmare color grading it. So I'd rather be consistent. And then so over here is which LUT we're using. And so right now it's defaulted to the Sony A6700 LUT. This is, again, this does not bake it into the image. This is just what you see on the screen while you are recording. This helps you get a better judge of exposure and color. This adds some contrast and saturation. So if you choose S-Log3, this won't put any LUT on there. It'll just show you, it's a little confusing, but this will just show you the log footage. S709 is, again, that basic technical conversion LUT. You can add in your own custom LUTs too, which I will show you later on. But if you don't have a LUT to add and you want it to look a little bit more saturated and contrasty, just choose S709, and that's a good place to start. So because we chose our HS codec, we now need to come in here and select our bitrate and codec. So I always choose the highest one, 100 megabits per second, 422 10-bit. You always want to choose 422 10-bit. Gives you a warning here about HS playback. So again, if you want to shoot in HS, maybe take a couple clips, run them in your computer, make sure your computer can handle them in the editing software before you go out and shoot for real with it. But again, I like HS. If you want something that's easier to edit, SI. Okay, down here is the proxy recording. I generally don't use proxy recording because all these codecs in here, my computer can handle it no problem. Wind noise reduction, I turn this off. I don't want the camera doing any audio processing. If I need to address this, I do this physically with a dead cat, mic placement, proper mic, that sort of thing. If I need to do anything in post, I'll do it in post. I don't want the camera doing that. This is the audio processing. I don't want the camera doing it. I'll say it that way. So over here is the mic level, and so you can adjust this to whatever you're doing at the time based on the microphone, the conditions, the subject, that kind of stuff. So that's the first page. Down to the second page, we already changed the log shooting settings. This is where you can format the card. I'm not going to format the card right now because I have a LUT on there that I want to show you how to import later on in the video. But if you select this, this will format the card. Now over here are the file settings, and this is something that is really cool to change. So basically what I like to do is name it. So if we go to file name format, we're going to change this to title. And then the title name settings, I'm going to hit OK here, and I'm going to change this to say the name of the camera. So let's call this A6700, and then put a space. Actually, I'm going to put an underscore. It's just what I usually do. You can do this whatever you want. And so now, all the files that come out of this camera will say A6700 and then a number. And that's really cool because if you are bringing this into your computer with other footage, you can see that these files are the A6700 files. So I do this with all my Sony cameras. I love this feature. So yeah, make sure you do that. It's cool. Okay, so the shooting mode we can't change because I believe it's because we're in flexible ISO, but again, we already set this to M on the top there to make sure you're shooting in manual mode. So in terms of steady shot, this is the different kinds of stabilizations. Of course, if you turn it off, there is no stabilization. If you have it on standard, that is the physical sensor shift stabilization, also known as IBIS or in-body image stabilization. And if you set it to active, that is the IBIS plus electronic stabilization. So it adds some extra stabilization. I usually recommend just leaving it in standard, and then there's some situations I might use active, but most of the time I'm just leaving it in standard because the active crops in and it's digital. It's not as good as the physical sensor shift stabilization. So, but it is there if you need it. This is where you can change from continuous to autofocus to manual focus. So if you need to do that, you can do that there. Again, as you're starting to see, you can do this stuff in a lot of different places. This is where you can change the focus area. So there are lots of different options in here if you want to dial it in for zone, center fix, spot, or expand spot. So, but I just generally leave it on wide because the autofocus is so good in this camera. Okay, this is the subject recognition. So for this is where you can turn the subject recognition on or off. So if you are shooting a person, a bird, or something like that, you leave this on, and then you go over here and you can select the different subject that you want to select or shoot. So if you're shooting animals and birds, animal, bird, insect, car, train, airplane, etc. Generally, I'm shooting humans or animals, so just select this to human. Now, the reason why you want to turn this off is if you just have you want it to generally focus on the scene and not pick out certain objects. So sometimes that's helpful too. So that's where you change that. All right, so that's the main menu. There's two different pages here, as you saw, and you can see that there's so much cool stuff in here. But let's keep going through the menu, and you'll see that a lot of the things in here will be duplicated for things we've already seen, but they're in here too. So if I've already talked about it, I'll just glance over that, of course. So file format, we already talked about, right? Those are the different formats. The movie settings, these again, this is what we already covered in the main menu. So S and Q, let's talk about this. So S and Q stands for slow and quick, and what this allows you to do is set the camera to capture images at one frame rate and then record it in a different frame rate. So this is really helpful for slow motion, but it's also helpful for speeding things up. And there is a new time-lapse feature in this camera too, which I will talk about that's related, but let me first talk about S and Q. So when you go to S and Q, you can also change this in another place on the camera, which I will show you. So basically, you select how you want it to record. So I'm going to record in 24 frames per second because I shoot in 24 frames per second. And this is what the camera is going to be sampling at. So if you set it to this will sample at 120 frames per second and then record at 24 frames per second. So this will be a ×5 slow motion. And it's cool now they added this where it'll tell you, the amount of time you need for the amount of footage that you'll get. They show that in here, which is really cool. Now, I generally set this to 60 because, for example, if I'm doing real estate videography, I record in 60 frames per second and slow it down to 24 frames per second, and that'll give me a 2.5 times slow-mo. So what are the downsides with this? Well, first of all, you bake in that slow motion or sped up speed. You can't change it later, and it also doesn't record audio. So for me personally, I know I'm going to be shooting all my clips at 60 and changing them to 24. I can do it in camera, and then I don't have to take that step in post. But you don't have any flexibility because at that point, I've already baked it in and I can't play it back at normal speed, and I don't have any audio. So you don't necessarily want to do this in all situations, but it's really handy in those situations. Now, before the new time-lapse feature, what I would do if I wanted to do a time-lapse was I would just come down here and set this to 1 frame per second. And you can see ×24 quick motion. So what this is saying is that I'm recording in 24 frames per second, but it's only recording 1 frame every second. So it'll speed it up by 24 times. And on the bottom here, it's really cool because it says, as I said, 5-second movie. It takes 2 minutes to record that. So it takes 2 minutes and speeds it up 24 times into 5 seconds. So this is the S and Q mode. Now and then you can go in here and of course choose the highest codec and bitrate. Now there's also time-lapse setting. And so this sets up very similarly where you can set your base rate at 24, but now in terms of frames per second, it has the interval time. And this is how long it goes in between taking a photo. So what this shows here is 1 second. This is the same as 24p and 1 frame per second, right? Because it's every second it's waiting to take another photo. So it takes 1 frame every second. And you can see at the bottom here, it says the same thing, 5 seconds for 2 minutes. But if I bump this up to, let's say, 5 seconds in between each one, it'll take a 5-second movie recording will take 10 minutes. So you can go through and change this however you want. Generally, I have it record more often, and then if I need to speed it up, I can just speed it up in post. But if you want to save on file size or you know exactly what you're doing, you can change that here. But let me show you how you do this when you're setting this up here. And again, you can change the record settings and the video light settings as well here. And if you're ever confused about what anything is in the menu system, if you see here the trash can with the question mark, you can hit that and it will tell you what that setting is. Okay, so if we back out of here and I just change the dial on the top here from movie to S and Q, it brings up this menu. So it says, do you want S and Q or do you want time lapse? So now you have the option. So if you choose S and Q, and let's go back to the main menu like we were before. And the first thing here, which used to be just frames per second, right, your frame rate, you now have the S and Q options. So 24 frames per second. Let's say I want to set this to 60 frames per second, like I was saying, like I do for real estate. Now, if you want to do time lapse, I just turn it off, turn it on, and go to time lapse here. And now when you go into the main menu, you'll see you have the time lapse options like we had before. So I really like this implementation. So really simple to set up, but let's go back to movie recording. Back to where we were in the menu. So S&Q and time-lapse log shooting, like we already said, we already saw this in the main menu. Proxy, we talked about lens compensation. This is where you can turn all of your corrections on. So I turn all of them on auto. The focus breathing compensation is if you want it for certain lenses and those sorts of things. Keep in mind it will crop in a little bit, so use it if you want it, but basically it digitally crops in and then counteracts any focus breathing. It's not on every lens, but I'm gonna leave it off for now, but if you want it, turn it on. But I always turn the other ones on because they're a lot harder to fix and post. And a lot of the Sony lenses in particular, the cameras know where their faults are and they fix them in camera. So I generally like to let Sony do that. We have formatting the card, and we're not gonna change any of this stuff. Record image database, display media info. Down to the third page, we have the write serial number on or off, and then the file settings. And so this we already talked about. Onto the fourth page here, you're not gonna be able to change these because we're in movie recording mode. And down here is the memory setup, memory recall setup. These are the custom modes that are on the top dial here. So if you want to change something to memory card 1 or memory recall 1, you just set up the camera however you want. You change all of the codecs, frame rates, autofocus, ISO, aperture, all the stuff that you want, and then you just come over here and register it as one of the memories. And you can do different ones for photo and video. So that's where you set that up. Silent mode settings, I think I leave this off for the most part. This will turn off everything on the camera, but there is a way to turn off the beeping later, which I will talk about. Release without lens, I do like this. Basically, this is important because if you're shooting with a fully manual lens, then it may not register with the camera, so make sure you leave that on. Anti-flicker set, this is really interesting. I don't use this very often, but basically you can have a variable shutter. So let me show you what that looks like. So when you go back out here, you can see that the shutter is now 50.7, 50 point, you can really dial in the shutter speed, which is really helpful in a couple of situations, specifically when you're shooting with different colored lights or different non-video lights. If you see something flickering, you can go in there and just change the shutter speed a little bit to avoid the flickering and to avoid the frequency of that light. So that's where that is too. So that's pretty cool. We already talked about auto recording. Of course, we have it on the level, which we talked about before. Audio out time, you want to leave that set on live. And again, we turn the wind noise reduction off. If you plug in the hot shoe adapter, there are settings in there too to adjust that. Here are the time code settings if you need to do that. I'm guessing most of you do not. Stabilization, which we talked about before. Now, one thing I have to mention here is that if you are shooting with a manual lens, then you have to come in here and change the focal length manually. So basically, if it won't communicate with the camera needs to know what focal length. So for example, if you're shooting with a 50 mil lens, make sure you set this to 50 millimeters. But for most of you, make sure you leave this on auto, and that way the camera knows the focal length that you're shooting on and uses the proper stabilization. A couple of zoom options here. I generally don't use clear image zoom or digital zoom, and I just leave it on optical. But if you want to use clear image zoom, it can be handy in some situations, but I generally just leave it off. And if you do use the zooms, there are some adjustments here for speed and stuff like that. Here in this section, you can turn the grid display off if you want rule of thirds. One thing here is the record emphasized display. So let me turn this on and I'll show you what this is. So if we come out here and we hit the record button, oops, and you can see that it has this red box around the outside. So that will help you see that you are recording. And I generally turn this off because there's only so much real estate on this little screen. But if it is handy for you, like if you're vlogging or you're in front of the camera and you just need to see it, that will help you see if you're recording or not better. But I generally leave it off because the screen's only so big. Different marker displays here that you can set up if you're interested in doing that, but I just leave those off for the most part. Onto the 12th page here, this is where the self timer is. Again, we saw this earlier. I generally leave that off, so if I'm gonna go record myself, I'll just hit the button and then go get in front of the camera, that sort of thing, but it is an option. The auto framing is in here. This is a new feature that's in the ZVE1. I think that's the only other camera that has it at the moment. I think they're probably going to be putting in all their cameras moving forwards. It's pretty cool. Basically, what this allows you to do is track you or a subject, and it will reframe the camera to get the subject in the center. So you can turn that on and off here. And then there's a couple different options. The biggest one is going to be the crop size, so from small, medium to large. So I'm going to leave this off for now, but that's where the auto framing feature is, and you're going to have to do some experimenting to figure out what works best for you. All right, so that's it for the camera menu here. So let's go down to the exposure menu. So auto slow shutter doesn't really matter because we're shooting in manual mode, so you can leave it on or off. I guess I'll just turn it off. The ISO, which we will change manually while we're shooting, but we already set it to 800, which is the base in S-Log3. And then the ISO range limit, if you want to put hard stops on your ISO range, you can do that here too. This is for automatic exposure. So again, we're shooting in manual mode, but if you were to shoot with a automatic exposure mode, you can set the exposure step here. Metering mode, I usually generally leave it on multi, but you have options here for center weighted, spot, entire screen average, or highlight, but I generally leave it on multi. I use the histogram for exposure anyways, so it doesn't really matter so much to me, but that's an option there. And then face priority and multi-metering, spot metering, and center. So those are based on the other metering modes. For white balance, like I said before, we're going to set it manually and had it set at daylight, and these are for automatic white balance settings, which I don't change because I use manual white balance. Down to the color tone section here, you can see there's some stuff grayed out, and that's because we're in S-Log3. So when you're in S-Log3, you don't have the option to turn the D-Range Optimizer on, which is a way that the camera adds some more dynamic range to some of the baked-in profiles. Creative look, picture profile, again, these are all turned off. Next is the LUT. This is what we had before. This is where you can select your LUT. Again, you can do this in the main menu, and I said use the S709 LUT if you don't have a LUT yourself. So the other thing I mentioned before is we can add our own LUT. So let me show you how to do this. So first of all, when you add a LUT to the camera, you have to have it in a specific folder. So on the SD card, you put it in the private Sony Pro LUT, and it has to be a cube file, either a 17 or 33 point LUT file. If you put in that folder, then you put the card in the camera, go to Manage User LUTs here, and you can import it. So I have a LUT in here. I'll show you how to bring in. So I have that LUT already in that folder structure in the card. It's in the camera. So we go to User 1, and you can see here that I have the Phantom LUT, the neutral LUT. So I'm going to import that and hit OK. So now that's in there, and so you can edit, import, delete, and then if you go back to select LUT, now you can see that if I choose user 1, I have the neutral A7S3 LUT, which is the Phantom LUT. So that's how you import that. Again, this will not bake that LUT into the image. That's just what you see on the screen when you are rolling and judging exposure and all that kind of stuff. But what's really cool with these cameras, especially even a camera as lower end as the A6700, you know, I expect this kind of thing in the FX cameras, but allowing you to put a custom LUT in here so that when you're shooting, you know exactly what it's going to look like. That is super, super cool. Again, soft skin effect, don't use that. Zebra display. So what I do, I don't use zebras for exposure. I use a histogram. And if you're curious about how I exposed and color grade S-Log3, I made a great video about that, which I'll leave linked down below. So if you're just getting into shooting log, highly recommend you check that out. It'll get you started. But I do use the zebra when I'm shooting inside and getting my exposure using a gray card. So I will set this to 45%. So if we go down to the custom, and I'm going to change this to 45, which is what you want to get a gray card with the S709 LUT. I'm not sure what it is with the Phantom LUT, but we'll set this to 45 and plus or minus 1. But you can change this to whatever you want. Some people use this to check clipping and highlights. Some people use this for skin tones. Again, if you're curious about how I expose and color grade, go check out that video. All right, down to the focus section here. We covered some of this stuff before. Focus mode is either autofocus or manual focus. The autofocus transition speed, this is set to be cranked up all the way. I turn the speed and sensitivity to 3 is kind of where I like it on both, so it doesn't go too quickly, but it's kind of down the middle. Again, depending on the subject you're shooting, the situation, the lens, all that stuff, you can tweak this to make it really, really work. But I generally find if you leave them down the middle, you're good in most situations. I know it's not really that surprising putting it down the middle, but autofocus assist, this is cool. What this does is allows you to make adjustments with the focus on the lens, and then it kind of overrides the autofocus, but I'll just leave that off for right now. Focus area like we talked about before. I'm not going to change any of these settings in here. All right, so there's some more autofocus settings here to talk about. First of all, the first two are in the main menu and also on, I've already showed you in a couple other areas. So the subject recognition, that's if you want to turn this subject recognition on and off altogether. And then again, the different subjects. This one here, recognition target select set. So this is like if you don't use certain ones, you can disable them so that when you're toggling through, you don't have to see them all. But I'll leave those all in for right now. You can select between right eye, left eye, and auto. You might wonder why this is even a thing, but for example, if you are doing like a interview and you're doing like a side angle shot and the camera's coming from this side, you might want it to just focus on the left eye or the right eye, and just so it's not hunting back and forth. So you do have that option, it's pretty cool. This is to put the subject box on the subject, so when it recognizes a human, it'll show the box on there. Definitely leave that on so you know that autofocus is working. There's also a face memory mode, so this is pretty cool. I haven't played around with this too much, but you can like have it remember certain people and then focus just on those people, so that's in there too. Focus mapping is a cool feature that shows this cool display on the screen about how to get focus. I made a whole video about that when it first was debuted in the A7 IV. I'll leave that video linked down below. I don't use this as much. Some people like it. I use focus peaking if I'm going to be using manual focus, but it's a tool that's in there. So the focus magnifier is also in here, and you can make some adjustments there. So peaking display, this if I'm using manual focus, I will turn this on, and then I like high and I like red. Those are my settings. So if you are going to be doing manual focus, when you put it in manual focus, you'll see the peaking show up, and anyways, that's in there. So I'm just going to turn this off for right now. I generally put this in the function menu so I can access it a little bit faster than diving all the way into the menu. So that's it for the focus section. In terms of the playback, I don't change anything in the playback settings. And I don't change any of the stuff in the network settings. I don't use this for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and all that stuff. If you are using that stuff, you know, you can dive in there, but I'm just getting you started here for shooting video in the best possible quality. So there's a lot of settings in here. So in the area date, of course, you can change the language area date. The NTSC PAL selector, I'm not going to change this, of course, but what this does is it changes from regions. I'm in the United States, I'm in North America, so I use NTSC. So that'll give you frame rates like 24, 30, 60, 120. If you're in Europe or a lot of other places, you can choose PAL, which is 25, 50, and 100 frames per second. So a lot of people, when they get their cameras, they say, Josh, I can't see 24 frames or I can't see 25 frames. This is where you change it. So depending on what region you're in or what region you're producing content for, go in here and you can change that. So again, NTSC for the United States. This is where you can reset the settings. I'm not going to do that right now, but this is how I did that when I started this video out. You can also save and load your settings, which is cool. So if you're going to have a firmware update come out and you want to back up your settings or you want to experiment with your camera, you can save it. Or if you have a second body, you can save it, take the card out, put it in another camera and load it in. Or if you want to give your setting, or if you're borrowing someone's camera, you can put your settings on there. Or if you are lending your camera to somebody, you could save your settings so when you get it back, you can quickly load it in. So again, you can save the settings here to the memory card and then you can load it back in. So pretty straightforward and easy to do. Okay, let's start customizing some of the dials and buttons. So I'm not going to do the photo stuff, but we will go over some of the video stuff here. So these are all the different buttons on the camera, and so you can set them to whatever you want. They come out of the box set to follow the photo mode, but again, I'm a videographer, so we can change them to whatever. Let's see, I don't remember what this one is set to. This is set to white balance. That's cool. So this is the button that's over here on the side, which is kind of a new feature on this camera. So that, we'll leave that there. I don't change these buttons on the back here, 2 and 3. Of course, this would be the autofocus. I do like that, and then you have the function button, so that's cool. And then the trash can here. Although you can't actually change the function button. So onto this set here. I don't change these either, so I just leave them all as default. So the top buttons here, though, I do change them, and not the number 1, which is the movie record button, but the second one here, I actually changed this to open up the main menu because I go in there so often. So I'm going to go here and choose Display Main Menu. So now when I do that and I press the button on the top here, it will just go right to the main menu because I use this all the time. So for me, that's a super handy thing to have. I'm gonna go down to the button that's on the side of the lens. Not every lens has this, but some lenses do. And you know, the GMs, and I have the 35 1.8 on here, which does as well. So I like to set this to change my subject recognition. So under subject recognition, so basically this turns subject recognition on or off. So if I am just shooting the general scene and I want autofocus, I'll turn this off. And then if I want to turn it on and grab a certain subject, it will do that. So again, autofocus, see subject recognition off and on. So that's what I like to set that to. Again, it's personal preference, but that's what I like. Now to the dials. So first of all, you can have it set to manual mode and other modes, but just leave it like that. So the button on the front here, I change this usually to, recommend changing this to the shutter speed. And that's, so the button on the front will control shutter speed. The button up here will be aperture. This is all personal preference. It's just what I've gotten used to over the years. And then the dial on the back right here, we'll set that to ISO. So this is what I recommend that most people do if you're just getting started with this camera. So you have all three exposure controls ready to go. Now, I'm gonna give you a little bonus here. What I like to do is probably a little bit unorthodox, but I am really a videographer and I don't change a lot of the settings like I did before. So what I like to do is actually, and you don't have to do this, is again just what I like to do, is I turn the shutter speed control off because I'm not changing the shutter speed, because I'm leaving that at double my frame rate. And then lastly, I don't change the ISO very often, so I actually turn that one off. So you might be wondering, Josh, why in the world would you do this? Well, this is a small camera. I have medium to large size hands, and I am always bumping buttons and dials, and I don't want to change things like shutter speed or ISO by accident. And then you might be wondering, well, how do you change this if you need to? Well, if you back out of this, and again, you press the main menu button, which I put that custom button on the top here, where does it go? It goes to frame rate and shutter speed. So like if I need to change my shutter speed, well, let's say I'm gonna go to 60 frames per second. Well, I go to 60, and then I just change my shutter speed to 1/125. It takes like 2 seconds. To me, that is worth it so that I'm not bumping this by accident, because I know that I've shot so many times when I was at 1/30 or 1/80 or something like that because I just bumped this by accident. So that's why I disable it. Now, with terms of the ISO, again, very easy to change. I'm very deliberate with my ISO because I'm gonna reach for aperture or ND or lighting before I change the ISO. So again, that's what I like to do. It's not for everybody, but I'm just showing you how I like to set up the camera. Okay, yes, that was all that was in this setup here. So there's custom functions for photo and also playback. Now the function menu settings. So this is what's going on in that function menu. And generally, I think these are pretty good. The only thing I'd probably want to see here is the focus peaking. So this is the photo setup. This is the video setup. I don't change the skin softening thing. So I'm going to change this to peaking. So that will turn that on and off. But again, you can change this to whatever you want. Again, I don't change the picture profile, so maybe I would change this to zebras. So zebra display. You can customize this however you want, but focus mapping is here. A bunch of the other features are in here. White balance, that's a good one to have. Subject, which subject you're using, and then turning the subject on and off. Focus mode. You can, again, tracking. These are all good ones to have in there. So again, the way you can access this is by pressing the function button, which will turn that on and off. Or, like I showed you before, you can just swipe up. Different settings for stills and movie. This, definitely do this. This is awesome. I select all these so that when you are going between photo and video, you're not carrying things over. I'm so glad they added this to their cameras a few years ago, and that when you go over to photo mode, you're not shooting in S-Log 3. So turn those on, turn those all on, in my opinion. So here are the display settings if you want to change, what is shown in there. I'll just leave these as default for right now. Recording with shutter, I absolutely love turning this on. What this allows you to do is you can press the actual shutter button to start and stop recording. I don't know why this doesn't come as default, but it doesn't. So you can start and stop recording with the record button that's on the top, or also with the shutter. I can never find the record button on cameras because I'm always using different cameras. The shutter button is really easy to find. So If you turn this on when you're in video mode and you hit the shutter, it will start recording. I definitely recommend that. Okay, and this is kind of weird that you can change the custom keys and dials in another part in the menu, which we just changed. I don't know why they doubled that up, but that's in there. There's also ways to customize your dial settings if you want to do that, but I generally kind of leave it all the same way. You can also change the way that the shutter and aperture rotate, and you can lock the dials and wheels there too. Touch operation here, you can turn this on or off, and there's a bunch of different settings. I'm just going to leave these all as default. Screen reader is really cool. If you need that, it's in there. It'll read back stuff to you. Onto the Finder monitor page here. So in here is where we can select auto. So what this is set up for right now is that if I put my eye or anything in front of the EVF here, it will turn the screen off, turn the EVF on. So if you want to go back and forth, change to auto. If you want it on just the viewfinder or just the monitor, you can do that, but I'll leave it on. Actually, I'll change it to monitor right now so that it doesn't switch while I'm working here. Doesn't seem like I had that problem already. So monitor brightness, you can change this to sunny weather, which I recommend because it needs to be brighter outside. I'm going to turn it back to manual just because I don't want to change the way it looks right now for this recording, but you can go in and change this manually. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if you're in a really bright situation, you want to turn up, but if you're not in a bright situation, you don't want to have it up all the way because it'll look overexposed and it won't look right. So if you're shooting outside, set it to sunny weather. Otherwise, you might want to dial this in, but that's where you change the monitor brightness. And you can also change the viewfinder brightness, the viewfinder color temperature. For display quality, I set that to high. I don't care if it'll eat up more battery. Same thing with the finder frame rate. I just want it to look as good as possible while I'm shooting. And for monitor flip direction, I leave that on auto. That's if it flips around when you change the monitor, when you move the screen around. On to the next page here, we have some timecode options. Gamma display assist, you can see it's grayed out because we're using the LUT feature, the display LUT feature. So I don't know why it makes you change the gamma display type, even though it's grayed out. Anyways, we don't use that. We're using the display LUT, which we already talked about several times. The remain shooting display and auto review, I think are photo things. And then the shoot mode select a screen, and you can leave that on, that's fine. Now the auto power off, I make sure I turn this off. I don't want the camera shutting off. I want to have control over that. So if you're forgetful and you want to turn that on, but power save, start time, I just turn this all off. I want the camera to just run until I turn it off. Sometimes I'll have it set up and I go do something. I don't want to come back and wait for it to turn on. So the battery life is pretty good on this camera. You might want that for turning the camera off to save on, to have the camera overheat less. You gotta experiment with that, but generally I leave everything on. And of course the auto power off temp set to high. This is what we set when we first started up the camera. For whatever reason, if you want to change that, that's there, but please leave it on high. Volume settings, this is what will play back on the camera, so I turn that up all the way because the speaker is super tiny. The 4-channel audio monitoring, we only have 2 channels right now because we have the 3.5 on the side and then the internal mic. But if you had the XLR K3M in here, you could go through and monitor different audio channels. And the audio signals, you can have them on or off. I turn them off, but let me just show you what I'm talking about. So if they're on right now and I press the record button, you'll hear it beep and beep when it goes off. If you like that, that's cool. I don't, so I turn that off. So now when I record, it doesn't make a sound. So that's what I prefer, but you can turn that on and off there. The USB connections, I usually leave this as select when connected, and basically when you plug something in, the camera will prompt you and say, what do you want it to do? You can use it for USB streaming or mass storage and the other options here, but generally leave it as select when connected so that whenever you connect something up, you can make that decision. So USB LUN setting, multi, and USB power supply on so that you can power the camera over USB. Okay, HDMI resolutions. There's some kind of interesting stuff in here. So if you want to set your HDMI resolution, that's the resolution that's coming out of the HDMI port on the camera, you can use it in auto mode, but you can also set it to either 4K or 1080p. So I generally leave it on auto. Now, one thing that's weird is when you go to the HDMI output settings here, if you want to record internally while you have HDMI going out, you are limited to only 1080p. So this is probably not a big deal for most people. So again, if you're recording internally, you can't send a 4K signal out of your A6700. If you turn the recording, if you want to have 4K going out of the camera, over HDMI. You have to turn this off. Cannot record movies to a recording media, even if, right? So you basically have to turn that off, and then you can go here and select your output. You can select 4K, 24, 10-bit if you want. But most people are recording, so like if you are just using an external monitor, 1080p is fine. If you are, let's say, streaming and recording, and you want to stream in 4K and record in 4K, you can't do that. So set the output to 1080p, and that's what you get, is you get 1080p. So all the options are down there as well. HDMI info display is what will toggle on and off basically the info that's on the screen over HDMI. So a lot of times if I'm setting something up on the monitor, I need to see it, I'll turn that on. But if you're streaming or something like that, you probably want to turn this off so that you don't see all the stuff on the screen going out over HDMI. And then I just leave the control for HDMI on. I've never actually used that feature. All right, on to the last page here. So there are some video light options here. I don't think I've ever actually used this feature, so I just leave that alone. Sensor cleaning, you can do this manually here if you want to clean the sensor with the built-in sensor cleaning stuff. Auto pixel mapping, leave that on so that it does the pixel mapping for you automatically, but if you want to do it manually, you can do that here. In terms of the version, this is where you update the firmware, and I think actually there was a 1.01 firmware, which I should probably get on this camera, but it came out since I got this. Now, I do have to say that I didn't buy this camera, and this camera was sent to me from B&H Photo to test and review and make videos like this. So big thank you to B&H Photo for letting me borrow the camera and making it possible to make content like this. I highly recommend you go to B&H Photo to check out purchasing gear. I buy most of my stuff from there. There are always links in the description for the A6700, of course, and any other gear that I use on a regular basis. So again, big thank you to B&H Photo for making this possible. All right, as we're almost done in the menu system here, you can display the serial number and the privacy notice. I don't think I've ever checked any of that stuff there. And actually back to the beginning of the menu, which is something I skipped over, you can actually set up the My Menu section, and you can add items in here. I don't use this very much, but what we can do is you can customize what's in here so that you can have a list of things that you use pretty often. But I find that most of my stuff that I need to find is in the main menu or in the function menu, but there's one thing that I do use pretty often, and that is the HDMI info display toggle, which I was just talking about. So if you want to add anything in here, let me show you how to do that. So go to Add Item, and you go through and select the item that you want. So these are all the menu things we were just looking at. So for me, it's in the external output, HDMI info display. And we're gonna put this, look at this, there's 6 of these, but we'll just use the first one, and then it adds it to this location, and it says it's added. So now when we back out of this, you can see that on the left here we have the My Menu, and here's My Menu 1, and the HDMI info display is there to toggle on and off. Not everything you can assign to certain things, so if you can't put it in the function menu, this is another place you can put it, and maybe you have a couple things that you use very frequently, you can also put in there. As I showed you, there are so many ways to customize this, and you can set it up however you want. This is how I like to use my Sony cameras, and specifically with the A6700. I hope you found this video helpful, and you can get going and start shooting right away with this. And again, if you're interested in shooting S-Log3, because that's a big part of learning how to expose properly and grade it in this camera, that video is linked down below. Again, huge thank you to B&H Photo for letting me borrow the A6700. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.